Yes, I'm going to try and speak to a project I undertook with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and think about that in terms of this framework of precarious living in liminal spaces. There's quite a well-known shortage of accommodation for gypsies and travellers, and it's something that I found in the research. So I found this quite a useful framework to think about it. The paper's really quite an early draft that I'm presenting, so I'm hoping for a bit of debate and to knock it about in a corner really and focus a bit more, but I hope to have some findings from the research and some early thoughts. So I'll do a very brief introduction and background, and then I try to tease out what we mean by precarity. That's been done a couple of times already, so I won't dwell on that too much. But I'm then going to link precariousness or precarity and liminality and try and understand what we mean by that. And I think a couple of presentations, Gibson's and the previous presentation just now before the break, challenged the idea that liminality was a linear process or transition, and I think that certainly is something that's seen in Gypsy and Traveller site provision or non-provision. And then just because I'm preparing this hopefully for global discourses, I thought we'd talk a bit about talking about gypsies, a bit about the discourse. I really wasn't sure where to bring in the actual findings of the JRF research, and for this paper it's probably not terribly necessary, but I've included some slides, so depending on time I might skip through those terribly quickly and have those in case there are questions, but just to root this in the actual research. And then I suppose where I try and embed some of the stories from the research in the understanding of precarity and liminality is in this question of, are we providing sites or controlling spaces? I'll try and talk a bit about ghettoization and anti-ghettoization from Lecompte. So, what's the issue? What's the background? Many gypsies and travellers live in precarious situations. There are those on the roadside in unauthorised encampments. They're sometimes literally located in dangerous spaces next to roundabouts or places where children could get run over, places where there's no access to water. A longer term precarity would be limited access to public services, education, good health, and using the word good culture, there's a barrier, I suppose, to accessing that wider community good culture in some of these actual dangerous spaces. So in that element, they live precarious lives. But there's also marginalisation and precarity even on local authority provided sites where you would expect there to be a level of security, a level of safety. Certainly some of the sites we visited, there were elements of danger, I suppose, either built in through site design or in the relations between the residents on a site or in the relations between site residents and their neighbours or council officers. So there are lots of strands of precarity and marginalisation that come out in Gypsy and Traveller lives. This is what tabloid newspaper readers expect to see when they hear the word gypsy or traveller. And so anyone who doesn't live in one of these is not seen to be a real or traditional gypsy or traveller. So to that extent, they are precarious lives as well. I hopefully have time to read out a short quote from Damien Labasse. This kind of ridiculousness of having to continually say, this is who I am, and we're allowed to modernise too. We don't have to carry on living in admittedly beautiful accommodation, but incredibly expensive Vardos like this now, and not terribly convenient. So, but gypsies and travellers, and people also talk about Roma in the same breath, and indeed I do at the moment in the paper, but they need distinguishing in terms of accommodation, not in terms of their marginalisation in media debate. There are some very strong similarities, but accommodation-wise, Roma don't live on Gypsy and Traveller sites, so that's the distinction really for the purposes of this paper. But we're talking in Europe of sort of up to 12 million Roma, Sinti and Gypsies, Europe's largest ethnic minority group, extremely marginalised in terms of education outcomes. So when we look at the the previous paper where you're talking about employment precarity, that on top of this, that really makes, I call them super marginalised in the paper, but Gypsy and Traveller lives are kind of ramped up beyond what we might see in the mainstream population. There are no really solid figures on the numbers of gypsies and travellers. Sometimes because they are discriminated against, they won't ascribe as such when asked on ethnic monitoring information. So that's not a surprise, because they're not treated well. However, there are some figures. There's a suggested estimate that about a third of gypsies and travellers live on sites or on the roadside. The rest live in housing. And actually many countries across Europe, there's been much more mainstreaming of accommodation, if you like, and certainly with the Roma population where people do live in bricks and mortar. And certainly we see unhappy gypsy and traveller households in bricks and mortar, people who say as part of accommodation assessments we would rather live on a site. And that's about being with family, permeable walls, if you like, being close to community. So the culture has been seriously eroded, and where it's not been eroded, it's constantly questioned if it doesn't live up to some kind of traditional romantic ideal. So in the draft paper, I try and question what is meant by precarity, and I won't spend too much time on this. As I say, others have already looked at this point beautifully, so I can't really do better than that. But I quite like the work of Judith Butler, where she looks at identity and precarity. So I touch on a quotation of hers, and relate it a bit to another paper I wrote, where it's about performance of identity, and that links with what I've just said really about, in certain ways, gypsies and travellers have to perform who they are. They're kind of on the social stage for the rest of us to appreciate, and they either perform or they might pass on their identity, that pretend that they're not a gypsy and traveller, depending on the scenario that they're in. So men might try and say that they're not part of the gypsy and traveller community to get employment, or they'll deny their identity and so on. So I was interested in Butler's take on precarity and identity and performance in that respect, and I'm going to tease that out a bit more in the actual paper. I was also interested in Waite, who discusses precarity as both a condition and a possible rallying cry for resistance. And again, I think when we look at gypsy and traveller sites as sites of protest, then you can see that. So Dale Farm, which was the largest unauthorised development, and here, although it's called an illegal site, it was owned by the people who lived on it. It just didn't have the planning conditions to live on half of the site. And that became a physical point of resistance, both in the living on it in the day-to-day, but also as an actual protest during what was a very contentious protest. It was, on the front pages of all of the papers and everything. It became an actual site of protest during that moment as well. So I thought that really spoke to what Waite was trying to say about precarity. And as I mentioned briefly earlier, I like the work of Loic Wacon, who also looks at precariousness. But I think it's particularly interesting looking at gypsy traveller sites in the terms of what Wacon calls ghettos. And later on I'll talk a bit about anti-ghettoization and actually how that's a bit of a problem in undermining what could be quite a nice solid geographical site of protest. If that's broken up, then it undermines the kind of collective action, if you like. So all of this led me to be highly confused and realise that precarity is a very complex term, and it can't, although I've glibly referred to it a couple of times, it's difficult to nail down as to what exactly we mean. And I was fascinated by the previous paper on precarity in housing, and certainly that's reflected in England. The private rental sector is rocketing in terms of market share. And the lack of regulation, revenge evictions, all of this, it can really mean that lives are increasingly precarious. And Beer et al. Have written a paper quite recently looking at housing and precariousness. And they've got like a three-line process of understanding, one of which is around affordability, which is the standard affordability threshold of 30% of income. The second point they refer to as living in private rented accommodation. So the whole sector, according to Beer et al., is precarious, which again is an interesting one. And thirdly, the third measure they use is whether, in their particular study, whether the survey respondent had been affected by a recent forced move. And I thought, well, actually, these three rules, when applied to Gypsy and Traveller sites, because just as local authorities are not building homes in the social housing sector, and affordable is seemingly 80% of market rent, which is ludicrous in some areas, as we know, it's not happening with Gypsy and Traveller sites either. So where there is state withdrawal and where the private rented sector step in, and where that sector is unregulated and hugely expensive, it obviously leaves a lot of people out in the cold. And as soon as you mention Gypsy Traveller site development, it causes even more protest than if you're going to develop social housing. So I then tried to move on from thinking about what we mean by precarity to what we might mean by liminality, and it did strike me in the earlier discussions in the papers that liminality is not a linear process, although I think people have tried to suggest it's like a transition in our lives. So a liminal space might be, for example, puberty, where you move through it and you then come through into adulthood. And if you put that onto kind of people in their early housing or employment careers, we would expect that to be actually a relatively short period of time, leaving home and getting settled either into private rented or owner-occupied or social housing. But that is either delayed or for a very long period of time, or alternatives occur where it's unsatisfactory housing or indeed homelessness. So I think this idea that a liminal space is a linear model needs to be rethought. And I read a couple of different papers talking about this, Lucas, Myra and Frank. I won't talk in a huge amount of detail about them. But I think people dip in and out of it. So you might have a couple of failed attempts to move out, in your example. A couple of failed attempts to move out, and you might pop back to mum and dad's as a safe space and then try again. I think this also happens in terms of Gypsy and Traveller sites to a degree, particularly unauthorised encampments, where you might try a couple of different spaces and then eventually find one where either there's not a huge amount of attention attracted, or it's possible to stay for a certain period of time, and that's negotiated. And I'll come on to that negotiated stopping approach quite shortly. So, yes, I think these liminal spaces, I was thinking in terms of a period of time in travellers' lives, but actually in terms of a geographical, marginalised place as well. So traveller sites, particularly ones where local authorities have tried to build them, tend to be on the outskirts of villages or towns. So they might be near railway sidings, rubbish dumps, absolutely. So they're in places where they've either exhausted a list of sites where everyone has objected, and then they've come to a point where surely no one's going to object to this. Actually, the very last people that are asked about the desired location of a site are the residents on it. So at all stages in the process of living on a Gypsy and Traveller site, or not being allowed to live on a Gypsy and Traveller site, travellers are the last people to be consulted on this. And linked to that, and it's not in the paper yet, but this government housing policy and changing of definitions and the impact on how people live is huge at the moment for Gypsies and Travellers in England. What the Housing and Planning Bill has done has redacted a couple of paragraphs around Gypsy and Traveller accommodation assessments, but also looked at identity in planning. So in equality law, it's very clear, Romany Gypsies, Irish Travellers, Scottish Welsh, they are protected under equalities legislation. They're recognised ethnic groups. In planning terms, Infuriatingly, Gypsy and Traveller is always spelt with a small g and a small t. There's no recognised ethnicity and it's dependent on nomadism. Under previous planning legislation, that was conditioned slightly, so you could have such a thing as a retired gypsy in planning law. So it would be somebody who had settled due to reasons of ill health, wanting to settle in a school for a period of time. And that has now gone in the Housing Planning Act of last year. So there's even no such thing as a retired Gypsy and Traveller. So their definition is undermined hugely. And I will actually just read out this quote, because this constantly having to prove yourself, not only just on the basis of, we're allowed to be modern too, sort of thing, but for the purposes of planning, having to prove that you travel around constantly and you can't prove your ethnic identity, and then you can't prove your planning identity either. They're almost flip sides of a coin. Damien Labath wrote this beautiful article, and within it you can tell he's so annoyed. He says, the cyclic oxymoronic situation is that the gypsy speaking to you cannot be trusted to tell the truth, even about the fact that they are a gypsy. Yet the only reason for this lack of trust is that they are a gypsy. I do hope such Kafkaesque ludicrousness becomes recognised for the inanity it is as soon as humanly possible, as at present it remains a key component of many gypsies' emerging diasporic experience, and it is boring and offensive. And I just think that's brilliant. And it kind of, this circular argument provides that identities and spaces that are very strongly linked together, and I talk about that a bit more in the paper, that the space links very strongly with the Gypsy Traveller identity, is undermined constantly, and actually the two can be used to argue against each other. So I'm going to try and dig in a bit to discourse around Gypsies and Travellers, because the debate is always surrounding, it's never including. If we think about the way that the Gypsies and Travellers are portrayed in the media and in political debate as well. There's been some successful action against some of the advertising around big fat gypsy weddings taken by the Irish Traveller movement, which was great, because these billboards were highly offensive and hugely edited, the photos. So there's another poster of some traveller girls, and they're in short dresses, they're on their way to a party, but what's being cropped out of the picture is the fact that their dads and their uncles are there, they're on their way to a wedding, it's a family thing, but it was cropped to such a degree, it made it like a completely different story, which is par for the course for the gypsy debate. And I think probably a little bit like liminality and precarity, these words where actually we can create scenarios where they're helpful to explain the situation we're talking about. That happens in academic research full stop, doesn't it? But I think the term gypsy and traveller can be a sort of empty signifier if we're looking at Leclerc and Mouffe and their ideas on notions of discourse and signifiers in discourse. And certainly I think the government and housing policy and planning policy certainly see the word gypsy and traveller as an empty signifier into which they can pour whatever definition suits the policy of the day, and creates even further marginalisation for them in terms of accommodation, and perhaps tries to get the government off the hook in terms of providing local authority sites. So just a little bit about the Joseph Rowntree research, and I need to do this much more elegantly in the paper, make the link between, because at the moment I've just used a couple of stories, because this has been published online already with the CIH, and I've got a few different things coming out of it. So it's always difficult, I think, at this stage, working out what goes where. So I'm at that stage with it, if I'm being honest with you all. But the Joseph Rowntree research, and it links in with the theme of the conference, I think, today on how we work with communities. This very much took a co-production approach, and I really don't like doing research. You sometimes have to do consultancy research for the bread and butter, external income generation for universities, but my preferred method is always a blank piece of paper and tell me all about it. talking with the people who the research is going to be about. And that really happened in this scenario. And I got a phone call and we went to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and we discussed it with them and said, well, this is the question we think that's being asked, and we want to look at conflict resolution approaches in site management and site delivery. And they said, well, yes. And it was all a bit lovely, highly unusual. But it meant that I could work with Janie Cardona, MBE, who is a Romani Gypsy PhD student with our university and was research assistant on the project. And we started off looking at 3 case study areas, which were anonymised in the report. And we worked with advocacy agencies in those 3 areas. And again, kind of developed questions with those advocacy organisations within which there were Gypsy and Traveller members. So it was very much a ground-up study. Joseph Rowntree then said, well, we want you to now do a national kind of study and go as far and wide as you possibly can. So I ended up going to all the countries in the UK, actually, and we interviewed 122 Gypsies and Travellers. We visited 54 Gypsy and Traveller sites, which gave us a really good understanding of how sites were run. All bar 2 of the sites were local authority or housing association run. So it was a really interesting piece of work, and there are lots of findings. I'm not going to go through all these slides, so don't panic. But I included them in the presentation just because, in case there were questions or whatever. But we did find kind of categories of site management and site delivery, mostly ticking along. Some grasping the net of really good site management, for example, in County Durham. And some are ostriches, putting their heads in the sand and really not dealing with accommodation issues. Actually, quite a few ostriches. Now, this I call the pothole of doom, and in terms of liminal spaces, it's a neglected space which reflects a neglected people. People actually talked about feeling neglected. And this pothole on an anonymous site and an anonymous case study. This could be anywhere, actually. It could be on a housing estate of council housing. It indicated a lack of communication and a lack of care with the residents on the site. And it became emblematic for the residents. Not for me, for the residents. They were really annoyed about this pothole, and there were so many bigger things that they could have been annoyed at. But in terms of the research, this turned into what we called everyday grind level of conflict. And it really made a difference. So in terms of the recommendations from the report, it's about communication, which doesn't fit in with this paper, but I included it here because it was about neglect and what's already a marginalised space. This particular site is next to sewage works. It smells. It's completely left out on its own. The fire brigade don't bother going when they're called sometimes. That's very flippant. For reasons the fire brigade have, they don't go on certain parts of the site. So this is the pinnacle of it. There's so much more underneath this pothole, but it really, it was an emblem of neglect. For balance, not all sites are neglected. Very pretty picture of a quite newly developed site, which it's only here to show the other side of it. Lots of key ingredients for site management, which is really for local authorities and housing associations, and I'm flipping through these not to be annoying, but just so that Matthew doesn't lay an egg that I'm going over time. And we made 12 recommendations, one of which is linked to negotiated stopping, which does have a key link with this paper from the finding. Yes. So negotiation is the flip side to eviction. In some areas, there's a really strong tendency to just continually evict, and that's response 2, which is at the bottom of the slide. So you can just see police serve their notice, use their eviction powers under the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act, and that some families are evicted more than 20 times a day. I mean, can you imagine? And so if we're talking about precarity, that really is, husbands might go to work and they don't know where their home is. They literally don't know where the partner has moved the caravans to, the children cannot possibly be educated in that scenario. So that's a fairly traditional response. Not ultimately traditional. Traditionally, travellers were seen as an important part of the agricultural economy, and there was an element of toleration, in the legal sense of the word, toleration, which travellers hate that word anyway, but it's always used. So an element of toleration, and that they had traditional stopping places, deep verges, where they would stop for a while and work on the land with the farmers, have a good relationship with farmers and other industries where they would travel across. And that there's been an increasing amount of bunding up of those spaces, and it links back to kind of mechanisation and computerisation of labour. So some of the more traditional areas of employment that travellers might have had have either gone by the wayside, or they've become so regulated that travellers who might have done a bit of bricklaying or whatever, now if they can't read and write terribly well, can't necessarily fill in the right level of paperwork, or can't get the right level of qualification to be employed outside of the community. So there are some real problems with that, and that I think in the paper I talk about shared realms, so not causality again, like you were saying. It's not necessarily cause between precarious employment and precarious housing, but they're so intertwined that it amplifies the effect. In the study we found negotiated stopping seemingly as an answer, and it was done in two ways: a kind of overt bridge route, and I'm using some language developed by Leeds Gypsy and Traveller Exchange. I think it's come from kind of Putnam's Bridging Capital. But they talk about overt bridges, as in this is the local authority saying, we are going to do this. We're going to have negotiated stopping. We've got councillors who will agree to this approach. Instead of going and serving a notice, we'll go and ask the travellers, are you okay? Which is always a nice starting point. Are you okay? What can we do to help? And is this a suitable location? And if it is a suitable location, how long do you think you will be staying? And there's some sort of contract drawn up on the basis of the answers the travellers have given and the suitability of the land and a variety of other, presumably political reasons at any given time. But it's an overt policy. Other areas where I've talked to senior politicians who said, yeah, we do that, I go along. And this guy's very senior now. He says, I go along with bin bags and say, you want to stay here, that's fine. Make sure you're gone by Saturday or whatever, because we've got the cricket match or whatever it is that is then going to be used in that common space. And that's sort of in Leeds Gypsy and Traveller Exchange language, that's a tunnel route. So don't upset the apple cart. We do it, but just don't mention it in your report or name us, because actually quite a few people do it. And if you start saying this is great practice, everyone should be doing it, it means we'll get into trouble locally and people will find out this is what we do. So people do put eviction notices in their drawer and don't actually do anything with them for a couple of days. It's very informal, which again, it's a very precarious situation, isn't it? Because if that person changes, that job changes and a new person comes in, there's nothing formalised that says this is how travellers will be treated when they come through our area. So we found this quite an inspiring idea in the research, and we know that some people do it informally, but it was a very strong recommendation that came out of the report that if there is central political will and that can support local political will, that this should be more out in the open, really. So I'm coming near the end of the presentation, but this was trying to think then in terms of the findings from the research, the understanding of precarity and liminality, and I mentioned Wacon's ghettos. Are we actually talking about providing sites, or are we controlling spaces? Even in the good practice of negotiated stopping, there's an element of, if we don't do anything, if we don't upset the apple cart, then we can control this situation. If we evict and they go to somewhere else, then that will cause more trouble. Or is it a method of informally providing a site? And in the paper, I talk about a mirroring of the notion of Lacan's ghettoization and Foucault's notion, which links in with anti-ghettoization, of a kind of heterotopia, which is a kind of a physical space. Foucault actually says it goes from kind of a crisis to deviation, and he gives a variety of examples, but it really occurred to me that traveller sites, and actually thinking about what Gypsum was saying about mining towns, there's an element of a kind of a space of othering, if you like, that I go into in a bit more detail in the paper. So I think that's an interesting notion that I'm going to follow up, this anti-ghettoization, because through using processes either of eviction or of negotiated stopping, and particularly where it's eviction and it grinds people down so much to the point that they mainstream their accommodation and go into bricks and mortar, this is really undermining any physical collective process of resistance. So in some respects in the report we find mainstreaming a good practice notion in terms of, say, repairs systems on traveller sites. Some local authority travel sites are great, some are really not great at all, and need to up their game and see accommodation broadly across the piece as something in need of quality processes, including repairs. So in some respects, mainstreaming is bringing a standard up so it's equal across no matter what type of accommodation you're in. But in other respects, mainstreaming undermines what it is that creates the identity of that marginalised group, and perhaps undermines platforms of resistance, of control. So again, that's something that I talk about a bit. I've mentioned hidden responses already. Another example in the paper that I talk about in the report is, and this is kind of severe eviction, if you like. There was an injunction taken out in a town against, there were 34 people named in this injunction, and then the 35th was unknown. So it was an injunction against, an injunction against any gypsy or traveller. So it's a sort of public space protection order approach, if you like. So the whole of this particular town has an injunction against stopping on public spaces. And coupled with that, one of the things, again, we found in the report is where there are good quality, well-managed sites, there's less objection to new sites. It's kind of obvious. But in this particular area, I went on a site and I've never seen anything like it. And I've been to quite a lot of sites for this research. And over the previous 16 years, I've been researching in this. And it was something else. It was, probably the most poorly managed site I've ever seen. So that, coupled with the massively wide levels of injunction against stopping, just seemed to be either the biggest control of space or the biggest ostrich-type behaviour of lack of providing spaces. And it occurs to me that's not a sustainable approach, that at some stage this particular local authority think they're controlling the space, but at some point there will be something will happen, some sort of protest will happen, either on the site or on an unauthorised encampment. Another piece of research I did that's in the paper very briefly was a long time ago, but looked at over 400 planning inspector decisions. It took a long time to read those. And the complex criteria that are used in local authority planning decision making, and the fact that one person's sustainability is another person's overuse of a particular road. So the sustainable element is, they're near town and they can get to library. But another person will say, well, there are too many vehicles turning out of this, so the highways will disapprove. So these complex criteria, mixed with the fact that we have these mythical spaces of green belt, which actually might be former dumping grounds or whatever. They're not the green spaces of our imagination. Those two mixed together provide further marginalisation of physical places and add to this precarity, if you like. And the encroachment and mainstreaming. Again, a couple of examples in the paper where a site was already there, and actually the local housing has started to creep out from the town or the village envelope and neighbour directly onto the site. In some places that's gone particularly well, and in one example there's a green space where there's currently some grazing, and they were suggesting for a moment, that's not happened, that for a while that could be a community area where the housed people and the people from the traveller site could play together, and that would have been great. And I would like to go back to that and look at that more in terms of the liminality of the space, if you like. But encroachment also causes some challenging discourse from those living in the houses about who has the space. This is our space, they'll say. No, the traveller site was here first, actually, in this scenario. So there's something around encroachment and mainstreaming and anti-ghettoization by stealth, by letting the housing encroach on the site as well. Can skip that, yes. So I don't really have a huge amount of conclusions. I was quite impressed by your 3 succinct conclusions in the previous paper. In fact, I wish I'd done something as clever as that. But I do think that negotiated stopping is the outcome of a condition of insufficient accommodation. And it's also a rallying cry of resistance, the fact that there isn't sufficient accommodation. And I think there's something around the negotiated stopping, particularly in terms of precarity of housing and liminal spaces, that I'm going to embellish further in the paper that I haven't yet done quite so much now. So, very well, luckily.
Okay, we've probably got enough time for about 5 minutes of conversation. Any questions for Joe?
Or suggestions?
Well, I mean, I don't know whether this is too boring to go back to the concept of precariousness, but it strikes me, listening to kind of several of the things that have been said so far, that in this notion of precarity, there are kind of two importantly different things. And one has to do with security, and the other just has to do with whether something is good or bad, or very unequal or more equal. And so, I mean, some of the things that you were talking about were just about, is the standard of the site a good site or a bad site or whatever. And then there's a whole different thing of whether you have secure access to something that is good. And I kind of worry that in combining these two things together, that the insecurity side of things takes precedence over the inequality side of things. So it's important to kind of try to keep the inequalities visible.
The image of a family being evicted 20 times in a day, like it's an appalling vista. There are 24 hours in a day. So presumably these 20 evictions happen from 9 to 5 when the evictors are at work. So they're obviously just following them around and harassing them. I was just wondering, just kind of as my devious mind in action here. You were saying that this would obviously impact on somebody's education.
Yes.
And I'm just presuming, and I don't know, that people have a right to education, compulsory education up to 16 or whatever. Presuming there's a right there as well as an obligation. Has anybody challenged this legally, taken on a local council and said, you're denying me my right to education, and therefore you have to do this or that to solve that problem?
Interestingly, there has been a question, I forget which MP raised it. The Irish Traveller movement have just put something recently on their website that they want to challenge a particular question that was raised around education, because again, like many aspects, it's used as a sort of carrot and a stick, if you like. It's two flip sides of a coin. So there is a right and a duty to do the right thing, but nobody follows up on the numbers. So I think in response to this question, there was a debate as to what information does the government collect on the outcomes of those who are homeschooled, whether they're Gypsies and Travellers or in broader society? And the answer, unsurprisingly for a government that makes policy not based on evidence, is that they don't collect the information, so it's impossible to answer that question. I think there have been lots of very well-meaning practitioners and academics who've gone on and on and on about the inequality of access to education and the poor educational outcomes for children, because it's almost, as soon as anyone says education otherwise or homeschooling, the state does that, well, that's fine then, and actually controlling the school space, if you like, that makes it easier, isn't it? But I think nothing is done then at the back end of that, but conveniently it's an excuse to then blame travellers for their own misfortune. You haven't educated yourselves or your children, even though we've not found out information about how you're doing it and what we can do to support. Traveller education service provision has been wildly scaled back. There's very little support to do that, but it's a convenience, I think, that if people say, well, it's education otherwise, then, well, that's fine, we can cross that person off the list.
Would it be interesting to do a class action, you know? I'm just thinking, you know, for somebody to take a class action against the state.
Yes. I think there are quite a lot of areas where people would like to take legal cases at the moment. Certainly on the Gypsy Traveller definition, they're looking for cases. I know they were looking for cases in this particular town on the injunction they wanted to challenge. But the massive changes to legal aid, and I touch on it very briefly in the cover, the big changes to legal aid mean that nobody's coming forward. So there's nobody to challenge, so it's a double whammy. Kind of the impact of austerity is a double whammy on the ability to challenge. And then coupled with that, if you've got people moving on and you haven't got a communal space where people can form a site of protest, it seems to be eroded on all levels, the ability to challenge this.
I think partly as well, though, it's because that it's, you know, it struck me in Joe and Collins as well, that it's almost like there is you know, so the right to housing is a really well established right, and that it should be, you know, it should have all those characteristics you talked about at the start, Con. And then you come to there's a traveller accommodation provision. And then I know Colin mentioned direct provision, and in Ireland we have a really serious, and that's the one I think will be the follow-up that we will all say, where were we, from the implications, because that's housing people who have no legal rights, no papers, no status in Ireland. And it's that, so that the right is met, Seamus, like education or accommodation, but in a traveller specific way or in a refugee specific way, or so it's like a right that's like I was interested in the signifier that, and actually I think it's a very full signifier, because when you put traveller beside accommodation, you immediately change the responses the state, the police, the local authority need to make. And similarly with education, where there is an absolute right, and I've heard of amazing cases where that's negotiated locally. It's maybe and not only is that right not being fully met by agents of the state, the way it's being met will actually perpetuate educational disadvantage, because it's like it's segregated at the back of the class, then travellers don't do well, but travellers don't do well in education, and then you start it all over again. So like in that sense, it's a really full signifier if you put traveller beside it, or whether it's education or health or accommodation. And similarly with refugees, which is what we now understand as direct provision in Ireland. I'm probably the only group that received direct provision, but would be happy not to.
That's really interesting. When I was presenting this, it's very lucky the APPG, the All-Party Parliamentary Group, the House of Lords, so we'll come along and present your work on the 12th of December. And so I had a seminar, and in response, one of the officers there from a local authority said, we're trying to develop some housing, and within that we've got some traveller site accommodation, and the lender is pulling out. The lender will not lend if the site accommodation is included. Now, I know there's been reluctance before now, but there were a few nods in the room at that. There were sort of 40 or so people, and there were a few other officers in the room who were nodding. So I think we're going to try and do something through the Homes and Communities Agency Equality Group to look at this, because that seems to me just direct discrimination on the part of the lenders. It's hard enough to get the funding in place, let alone, you know, and trying to provide sites, let alone that being something that could scupper a whole wider housing development. So yeah, I like the idea, and I might develop that the word traveller fills the signifier. Yeah, thank you.